Welcome to Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth listening to and remembering. I'm your host, James Nave. This show always airs first on WPVMLP Asheville 103.7, streaming online, WPVMFM.org, the voice of Asheville heard all over the world, and on other community radio stations like KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio, coming out of Taos, New Mexico. Thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song, walterparks.com, and thank you, Devine Dial, for managing WPVM-FM. And thank you, Robin Collier, for airing on KCEI in Taos. Community radio. Good thing, my friends. Today my guest is Andrea Watson. She's the publisher of 3, a Taos Press. I did this interview with Andrea a while back, and it was just so well received, I thought I would air it again for you today. Since Andrea is a publisher, she and I talked a great deal at length about poetry and writing and literature, and I started this conversation by asking Andrea what she thought poetry was about, and here's what she said.
Well, I think at this particular time, and obviously in the past, poetry is about what it means to be human. It documents people's lives, their struggles, their loves, their passions. And I think that on the page, it helps people communicate with each other and learn about other cultures and traditions.
How does it help one be more human?
I think poets and other people are often feeling that they're alone in the world. And when they read a poetry book or prose also, they have a connection and an understanding of other people's lives that probably reflect on theirs. And these are such issues as different cultures than they're familiar with, sexual, domestic, or elder abuse, and other issues that impact them so that they're not so alone when they read a poem.
So one of the things that happens on this show, people come on and we have lots of poets and artists and folks, and what I like to do is to offer some ideas for people in the listening audience, ideas around how they could more engage, say, an art form. So if somebody's out there listening, you've been in the poetry world a long time, you know a lot about it. One of the resistance points people have with poetry is, I just don't know what it means. So for somebody out there thinking, I'd like to be more involved in this, but how do I do it? What would you say to them?
I would say there are 2 ways to become more involved with poetry. One is to read poets from other time periods and also modern poets, especially the postmoderns, and to engage with them in that way, and also to attend events such as ekphrasis events where 2 art forms communicate with each other, so they're comfortable with the art piece and then they understand how the poetry piece responds to it. I think for poets themselves too, it's important for them to continue to read other people's work so that they see a bigger version of the world.
I often say to somebody who knows absolutely nothing about it, I say, go to the bookstore, open a poetry book and read the first line of the piece, and if you don't like it, put it back. Pick out the next one and read the first line. Don't even bother with the name of the person. Just find something that draws you in so that you have to move from the first line to the second line to the third line, and you just can't help yourself. And when you find that, that's a perfect entry point for you, because that piece is communicating an energetic to you and you are receiving that energetic, and it could be really simple, it could be really complicated. You don't know till you do that exploration.
Again, I think that we're drawn into books that reflect our own lives, and so we understand the poem better. I think it's very important when you pick a poetry book, people tend to look at who wrote the blurbs or the reviews, and I think, as you've said, Nave, you should go into the book and look at the first poem. For the poet, when it's published, that's probably their finest poem, and you'll know right away if that's a book that you want to engage with.
I'm thinking of poetry as a powerful kind of art form, and I know you've read a lot of poems. Do you have 2 or 3 pieces or 2 or 3 poems in your life that have transformed you, that changed you, that maybe undid you in a way?
One of my favorite poets is Beth Bachman, who is a fairly young poet. She wrote a book called Temper, and it's about the mystery of her sister's death, and there's a suspicion her father was involved. And the underwriting of that book, where even toward the end you're puzzled, is a very important thing to me when I read that particular book. I have other favorite poets. I think many of us began with Edgar Allan Poe, but for me, I looked at the early feminists, and for me, it was Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath. Anything by them. Anne Sexton's early fairy tale poems, Sylvia Plath's poem Daddy, of course. Those were the ones that I was drawn to and continue to go back to.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Edgar Allan Poe, because a lot of people in the audience know The Raven. And, of course, when they have heard The Raven, they've often heard it recited in a rhymey sort of way, like, once upon a midnight dreary, as I pondered weak and weary over many a curious volume of forgotten lore, as I nodded nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. 'Tis some visitor, I uttered, rapping at my chamber door. This it is and nothing more. A lot of people think poetry should rhyme because they've been exposed to The Raven and that rhyming nature of The Raven, which was designed to pull the reader along. However, you can switch that and say the poem without the rhymes. Just because the words rhyme in the poem doesn't mean they necessarily have to rhyme when you speak it like a story. So you could go, once upon a midnight dreary, as I pondered, weak and weary, over many a curious volume of forgotten lore. As I nodded, I was nearly napping. Suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. 'Tis some visitor, I uttered, rapping at my chamber door. This it is nothing more. So there are a lot of ways to use language. When you work with language, how do you wrap your head and intellect around using it? And why is it important for people to learn how to use language so that they can connect with their own power sources?
Most of us who attended elementary through college are used to rhyming poetry, which was the tradition. And the beauty of rhyming poetry is, as with songs that we all remember from the 60s, is that it helps us remember the exact lines. But the modern tradition of poetry, and postmodern poetry especially, is to have non-rhyming, because when you only worry about the rhyme in a poem, you are losing all of the other poetic techniques like metaphor, onomatopoeia, alliteration. You should be actually, in my opinion, as a publisher, concentrating on poetic techniques as opposed to worrying about the end rhyme. And I think that was why modern poetry began to lose the rhyme. And most of the books that we publish are not rhymed.
People hear the word end rhyme. What does that mean?
End rhyme means when the last or the penultimate words of a poem rhyme with each other, as you see in sonnets. There is something called slant rhyme where they almost rhyme, and that's pretty sophisticated because often it's done on purpose. It's not an accident. You are constantly looking at the end of a line of poetry and the end of the line of all the stanzas to see, oh, is the poet rhyming correctly? In modern poetry, we're looking for metaphor, which translates in Greek, moving from one place to another, which enables the reader to move from just reading a poem and looking for the rhyme to seeing things like imagery, detailing, specific words, alliteration, which is when consonants, 2 or 3 consonants in a row, create a specific sound, assonance, where they're looking for vowels, and you become a little bit more aware of how poetry functions when, as the reader, you're not always worried about the end of the line. You're looking at the whole line and then the stanza and then the poem.
I love the word onomatopoeia. Tell us what that means and why is that such an essential part of poetry?
Onomatopoeia is the sound that duplicates the thing you are trying to describe. For example, the hissing snake makes the sound of the snake. The meowing cat, you get the feeling of the sound of the cat. And for people who are not terribly familiar with poetry and want to find an inroad into poetry, those sounds are familiar to them, and they're kind of comforting when they read a poem.
I've always loved A Child's Christmas in Wales by Dylan Thomas, and he includes a lot of sound in his work. And one of the lines in A Child's Christmas in Wales, which I just, to this day, can never get over, is a line about birds flying across the horizon. In the line, you can hear the birds coming, you can hear them fly by your face, and you can hear them go on. Imagine the birds coming over the hill. And birds the color of red flannel petticoats whisked past the harp-shaped hills. So when you get to the harp-shaped hills, they're gone, whisked past the harp-shaped hills. And you have to set it up in the mouth in order to be able to get that bird flying by.
And the harp-shaped hills is that wonderful alliteration. So you get not only the sound of the birds flying by, but almost the shape of the hills themselves. And these are all important poetic techniques. And perhaps for readers who do want that inroad into poetry, they should get a glossary of poetic terms, because it's kind of fun when you learn that alliteration, for example, of the two H's in the heart-shaped hills. It's fun for them to go, oh, I recognize what the poet did there. Because we just don't sit down and write a poem. I think we first get an image in our mind or something that occurs to us during the day, and then we work on a poem, and then we add or subtract those poetic techniques.
And I think a lot of people who are listening might be thinking, wow, these people are having this conversation about poetry, and I don't know anything about it. And yet when you think about a metaphor, how much our language is built on the metaphorical nature of communicating, you begin to start to understand how we are all driven by that metaphorical sense of language. The day is heavy. How are you doing today? Oh, I'm rolling along. Or,
she is a beautiful rose. That is a stronger way to say it than she is beautiful as a rose, because as is the simile, but a metaphor is always, in my opinion, stronger. So you have that direct connection to she's a beautiful rose. You know exactly what the author of poetry or prose means.
yeah. Or you might see somebody and they look like they've had a hard day, and you say, you look like you've had a hard day, and that person might go, yeah, I've been pushing my car uphill for 8 or 9 hours.
I think we tend to look at life that way, and we bring out those phrases to help people understand exactly where we are.
If you're listening out there and you're thinking, well, I don't know anything about it, watch how you talk to the person in the grocery store line, or when you're checking out in the grocery store line. Watch how you describe the way you pick up the bags. Or if you are just having a casual conversation at a coffee shop, watch how you describe the things you are doing in the coffee shop. You will find you're using metaphors all the time.
I agree. Sometimes when I'm standing in line, particularly at a supermarket, there'll be someone in front of me, and you can see they're either lonely or they're talking to the person, the checker, for a very long period of time because they're lonely. And I'm always impelled to say something like, I think you're having a hard day. And there is that instant communication, and it's a complete stranger. But that type of metaphor connects you instantly, and then they tell you a little bit about their lives.
I ran into a woman in a coffee shop one time, and I'm not sure if she was crazy or having fun or what, but she struck up this great conversation. She started to describe this family, the mother and the father and Joe and Sarah. And she paused and she said, and you know what? They were all so dry they couldn't cry.
It's not funny, but it's true. You're right. There's the perfect metaphor, because we know exactly what she meant. I think that they were either very hard people, they didn't have a lot of humor in their lives, or they had tough lives.
The point is, she said it without giving it a thought.
We tend to speak in metaphor. I think some people are a little afraid of poetry because they think it's this high-flown, foreign thing to them, and maybe poets think they're these high-flown, talented people. But when people realize they're actually speaking in metaphor all the time, they're much more comfortable. And maybe that's something we should remind people. I know I should.
People often in this culture now doubt themselves. They doubt their intellect. They apologize because they don't feel like they know enough. And yet my experience is everybody knows a lot, and if they gave themselves credit for it, their lives would be a lot more steady, maybe, a lot more confident. They would feel better about themselves, just giving themselves credit for what they have now without having to acquire anything else.
I totally agree with that. I think in this particular day and age, people are a little afraid to speak their mind. They might insult somebody. The person they're speaking to might not agree with them. They may say something that someone considers shocking or ethnically might be offensive to somebody. But I think poetry cuts through that, because the second you even read a line of poetry, you understand that someone has had something happen to them or believes in something that you also believe in. The other part of poetry is you can disagree with it, and that's okay too.
I think of the poem written by Ezra Pound in the station of the metro. It's so simple and so easy to remember. The apparition of these faces in a crowd, petals on a wet black bough. People study that. They spend lots of time discussing it. And yet, if you've never heard it before, you feel the scene.
It's very interesting, because that is the perfect example of metaphor, that the faces become petals and the train is probably the black bough. I would have to say we all have taught that poem to middle and high school students. And for me, my students have never once said, I don't understand it. They understand it instantly. And you don't have to look for this, well, you do have to look for the symbolism, but not, years ago we were taught, oh, look for the symbolism and everything. You can't miss what that is about. It is the perfect example of metaphor.
I've spent a lot of time in Paris over the years because my good friend John Van Hasselt lives there, so I've taken many opportunities to go visit him. I always seem to end up there in the wintertime, especially in December, when the light goes away at 4 p.m., comes back at 9 a.m., petals on the wet black bough. Trees hold a few small leaves, and they're always dark, and they seem to stick to the bark. And whenever I say that poem, I see those trees with those leaves stuck to them. And then the people coming out of the metro, they rise up like the leaves, and they have that darkness around them because it's always dark in the wintertime.
I think you're talking about l'heure bleue, the blue hour, which is one of my favorite terms. For me as a poet, I actually don't look at it that way. I'm looking at the fascination that when you see the white ovals of the faces, they do look like the white petals. And to me, that black bough is the train. And I love the fact that as a poet, there's my metaphor. I don't think I think beyond that, because I'm fascinated how Pound compressed. I think it's only 3 lines, isn't it? Mm-hmm. It almost looks like a haiku. How he compressed it so that we understand it totally. And I think for poets, we're fascinated by the comparison use, as opposed to maybe the scenery. But for you, it calls up a time, the blue hour and the darkness. I've been in Paris, I think in November, and I had the same feeling of, that certain hour when things almost glisten or glimmer, but there's also a frightening scariness to it too.
Paris is a romantic city. People always sing, I love Paris in the springtime, or April in Paris. I've been very lonely, often in that city during that time frame. One of the other things about Paris, people on the subway, they stay to themselves. You don't have the animation, say, you might have on the Q train coming from Brooklyn to Manhattan, everybody looking at the city and going, oh, wow. And, the guys in the corner having a chat, and the 2 friends who just bumped into each other are talking, and then the little mother and the baby in the corner are carrying on. In the metro in Paris, everybody's quiet. Nobody looks at anybody. And when they get out, they just walk up those stairs. And those faces are like the petals on the wet black bough. And it's always wet in the wintertime, it seems like.
I totally agree. Yes, it is always wet in the wintertime. I was always fascinated on the metro. Instead of speaking to one another, they were reading a book. And sometimes they were reading Sartre, people that we grew up on and we so respect. So I think perhaps maybe it's a cultural tradition to read on the metro there. And I think, especially in New York, where I grew up, we were fascinated by the scenery of the people inside the train going from Brooklyn to Manhattan. We were impelled to talk to people. I remember a man going up and saying to people, he had some roses in his hand, and he said, "I'm going to give you this rose because you're the most beautiful girl on this subway today." And I can't remember, I think it was the IND. So there was a communication, but it was not literature-based. It was definitely an involvement with each other. And I think perhaps in Paris, it's just a different tradition of how one behaves on the metro.
I know in my times in the subway in New York, it's a cultural event. And if you've never been to New York and you've never ridden the subway and you go and you ride it for the first time, there's a good chance you'll be overwhelmed with all of the stuff that's going on and you won't notice the cultural activity. One of the things I've often noticed in the New York subway, and this has happened many times, an older person will walk through the door, often an older lady, maybe in her 80s. She enters the subway, and the young guys will stand up and say, "Take this seat." And they often will stand near her as if they're guarding her respectfully, and they allow this woman to sit. And so you see all of this stuff going on in the New York subway. Paris is a place of privacy. It's a place where people let you in, and when you're in, you're a friend for a long, long time. But you don't just get in. It's a different scene there because people love their privacy, and so that's why they read.
It's fascinating to me because I think when Americans think of France, and Paris in particular, they think of it as a place of lovers. And you'll see more public displays of passion and affection, especially on some of the bridges that I remember. So if you're there alone, as you said, you can feel very lonely because you're not part of that couple. But because America is more from a Puritan culture, I think we engage more with each other, but I don't see those same displays of passion and affection in the streets as I do in Paris. So there is that huge sort of dichotomy of passion versus privacy in Paris. And I think in America, it's a different sort of dynamic between people.
People in Paris have fallen in love with their city, so Paris is more than just the romance of a couple holding hands on the street. Many of those people on the Paris metro, they have come from all over the world to be part of Paris. So it's not just the Parisians who grew up there and their families have been there for generations. A lot of people from the other French areas come to Paris and they fall in love with that city. So they contain a certain amount of love. In New York, people are excited about being in the environment. So they have a pop to it that's not about love. It's about excitement and forward movement.
I think when people come to America, as many of our ancestors did, they come to America for a better life, and they want to be part of it as a citizen, not only as a visitor. And as we know, in our current times, that is becoming more and more of a tragic issue. In Paris, I think, from what I know, and I could be wrong on the dynamic of citizenship, people come to visit and they fall in love with the city, especially Paris, but also some of the provinces. But I don't think in their mind they think I can become a citizen instantly. Do you feel that way?
I agree with you. You cannot become an instant citizen. A good example of that is my friend John Van Hasselt. He's Dutch. John's been living there for years. He's still not a Parisian. His wife, Sylvie Porel, she's from the Vosges, but she's been living in Paris for years. Sylvie is a painter. She paints interiors of beautiful apartments. She's well respected and in demand. So when the Notre Dame burned, I was there 2 days after that happened this year, Sylvie said, "Oh, it's really, really tragic." And I am hoping that we, being the artist of the current time, will be invited to come to the Notre Dame and add our art to the beautiful church. So Sylvie understood the rhythm of history and of Paris, and she knew she would be able to maybe participate in doing something with the Notre Dame. That only comes from a deep citizenship that's been there a long time.
Here's what is interesting to me about also the differences between America and France. Even like many of us, when we graduated college, we were going on the tour with our friends. And we were fascinated that people who didn't know us at all would immediately say, why don't you come and have dinner at our house? Or we had a couple who said, oh, you three girls look a little lost here. Why don't you come and stay with us? I don't think that happens in America. I don't think someone in New York immediately says to a complete stranger, come and stay with us or come and have dinner with us, because there is a slight difference in maybe expectation or a comfort level. But I love that about France and other countries where I felt welcomed. There was in my mind, I don't think they would permit me to become a citizen without perhaps many, many years or not at all. But the friendliness and the welcoming were very important to me as a traveler, as a visitor.
And on that note, I would like to pause for just a moment for a station break. You are listening to On the Road with Twice 5 Miles Radio. I'm your host, James Nave. We're broadcasting on WPVM-LP Asheville 103.7, streaming online, WPVMFM.org. We're sponsored by Om Sanctuary, Asheville Community Yoga, Leaf Community Arts.
I'm going to be teaching a 6-week Artist Way workshop in downtown Asheville starting on Monday evening, October the 21st, 7 to 9 p.m., and every Monday evening thereafter until November the 25th, the Monday before Thanksgiving. So no matter whether you're new to the Artist Way or if you worked with it for many years, this workshop will keep you on the right track with your creative dreams and desires. You can find out more about it on my website, jamesnave.com. Nave is spelled Nave. I look forward to working with you.
Here's a salute to Walter Parks. Thank you, brother, for our theme song, wherever you are. I know you must be playing that guitar right now. I also wanted to let you know that WPVM-FM is a community radio station. The Asheville community is a very rich, vital community, and WPVM-FM serves it in many ways. One of the ways WPVM-FM serves the community, we have our door open for you. If you'd like to come down and take a look at our little museum we have on display, all radio artifacts from the telegram from a telegraph key through old radios, all the way up to what's going on right now. So if you have some children and the children are wondering, well, what is all this business about radio? How did it all start? You can come down to WPVM-FM and take a look. If you'd like to have a show, you can submit a proposal, and we have room for shows. We also have room for you just to drop by and say hello, and I most especially want to thank you for listening. That's a great way to participate in WPVM-FM because we're here for you. It's community radio, and it belongs to all of us, and however you engage with us, we really, really do appreciate it. And I also wanted to tell you I'm doing a project called Twice 5 Miles Publishing, and we produce guidebooks that address the stuff nobody tells you. And we have a few. We have one about how to tell a story by heart. We have one about how to sell a house. We have one about how to read for an audience, one about how to edit, the art of editing. And our goal is to create opportunities for you to learn how to be better at your communication, whatever that means for you. So if you'd like to know more about that, my email is nave@jamesnave.com. Nave is spelled Nave. If you would like to go to our website, you can go to twice5miles.com and see the books we have right now. And if you would just like to talk to me about anything you have on your mind, anything you fancy, send that. You can send an email to me, nave@jamesnave.com, and we can start a conversation. Like the conversation Andrea Watson and I are having right now, we started out with poetry. We've moved somehow into the differences between Paris and New York, which brings me around to continuing that with you, Andrea, by asking you to reflect on your time when you were younger in New York City, and you seem to know a bit about that subway system. And what was it like for you growing up in the city, and how did you engage poetry, and when did that happen for you?
I personally began writing poetry when I was 5 years old. New York had and has an extraordinary public school system, and I was encouraged by many teachers. all the way from literally kindergarten through high school, and then when I went to college. New York had so many cultures, and I think we were very spoiled because we thought that would be everywhere. And I think when we went to other countries that didn't have as many cultures and people trying to make things work with each other, I began to really appreciate New York, although I always had. I thought everyone went to the ballet. Everyone had a museum of modern art. Everyone had a symphony with a very famous symphony conductor. And when I traveled, I discovered in smaller places, obviously not Paris or London, but smaller places, that they didn't have those wonderful advantages. And I think growing up in New York, about literature and art, music, dancing, acting, we were privileged to have a very large world view. And I think I tried to bring that to anywhere I live now and to any of the books that we publish at 3. I think that's very important for people to understand other cultures. That's very important in Taos. In Taos, we have 3 cultures, Pueblo, Hispano, and Anglo, who work very hard at getting along and understanding each other. And that happens in Taos because of art and literature and the other arts on a daily basis. I don't know of another village in the United States where there is so much culture and interaction and trying to understand one another as there is in Taos. And New York, certainly when I was growing up too. But I notice it in Taos because it's so small.
Before we get to Taos a little bit more and go into the publishing company that you're working with, I'd like for you to go back for a moment to when you were growing up in New York. And you said the schooling was good. So what was your schooling like? Where did you grow up in the city? What was your experience during that time?
I was lucky that my grandfather was a house builder. So he gave his children houses. We grew up in Queens. But even as a teenager, I remember thinking, I really want to live in Manhattan because there was so much going on there. The school system in New York was extraordinary. I don't think I knew it at that time. For example, to graduate from my high school, Martin Van Buren High School in Queens, we had to speak 3 languages to graduate. So I took French, Spanish, and German. When I was younger, we had physics in 7th grade. New York had an extraordinary set of teachers and students who I think really wanted to learn. It may have been the 60s and the time period, but it was really amazing. And again, it was culturally very important that people in high school really got along with one another. We were constantly encouraged to read literature that certainly was above any grade level we had. I had 1,356 students in my graduating class. My high school had 6,000. We had 3 specific types of tracks of high school. But can you imagine with 1,300 in one class, how you still had to learn 3 languages, how you had to have physics, how you had to have all the chemistries. We had some extraordinary teachers running our schools. Yeah.
And when you say 3 languages, that's in addition to English.
Well, English was par for the course. But I was fascinated because when I talked to other people, they're like, well, I took Spanish. Wasn't that wonderful? And I'm like, no, because when I travel in Europe, I don't have a lot of trouble communicating. And they're always like, you had 3 languages. Yes, that was New York. And I think it still is. I have a lot of relatives who teach in it. I have relatives still there who graduated from schools. When we went to college, I thought college was easy. My college wasn't easy. The other thing about New York was that there was an enormous writing program. You did not leave New York unless you knew how to write a 5-paragraph essay. When I talk to people and ask them about term papers, they say, oh, I had 1. Oh, we had 2 or 3 a year. So when I look back, we were totally prepared for college.
Allow me to be a bit envious of you because I grew up in western North Carolina in the 50s, around Asheville, back in the time when education wasn't really that much appreciated. I remember my 7th grade teacher in the classroom standing there saying, this was 1959, there's no way man will ever land on the moon. And he was as certain of that as he could be. Of course, I'm sitting there thinking, well, I think there are already plans for the moon launch here. What are you talking about? And that was, in that moment, I somehow in the 7th grade understood that I was being undersold here, but I didn't have any options. So I am a bit envious of you. Later in my life, I went back to college and got my undergraduate degree, and I had so many holes in my education because I didn't have the opportunity to learn it and didn't have a mentor.
That's, I have to say, a tragedy. But I think many Americans from different places, other than perhaps the East Coast schools, maybe California schools, and I'm not denigrating, I think everyone was doing their best at the time. But I think growing up in certain cities, and I think this is true certainly in Europe, in Asia, in the bigger cities, where perhaps you had teachers who wanted to live there or administrators who wanted to be there, there was a worldview that needed to be communicated. I think that really is important. And I think it carries us for the rest of our lives.
And I think I have that 7th grade teacher to thank for showing me that that was not actually the way the world worked, and that the seed was planted there in that inventable elementary school for me to go out and do more. And then I have to give my mother credit, because when she was, and my grandmother credit, my grandmother graduated from Meredith College in 1919, and her sisters all had college educations, and that went back, and this was in North Carolina, down in near Raleigh, that went back into the 1800s. The women had educations on my mother's side. My mother had an education, and when I was a boy, she quoted Ulysses from Alfred Lord Tennyson to me. You are a part of all that you have met, yet all experience is an arch, where through gleams that untraveled world, whose margin fades forever and forever when you move. So my mother knew I had that thirst. The community and the school system during that time frame didn't know what to do with a lad who was aware that the horizon fades forever and forever.
But it's interesting that you're pushing up against that particular school system probably helped you to be who you are today. I think when we confront those things that we consider negatives in our lives, we either rise to the occasion or we complain about them, but you rose to the occasion. But having a mother, grandmother, women in a family, and also men, obviously fathers, is very important, because I think they set the tone for us for the rest of our lives. I think many of our parents are long gone, but there are moments when I think we all think, oh, my mother would have loved that. Or my particular mother was a follower of Krishnamurti. When I mention that, people are like, who's that? Indian philosopher. My mother introduced me to A Tale of Genji. We were constantly looking at books of different cultures. I don't think my father was as big a reader as she was, but for me, she set the tone of, this is the way you have to live your life. That books will teach you about things you need to know about, and things, like you said, you push back against.
Yeah, my mother passed away a couple of years ago, and over the years, she and I had great conversations. I've had her on this show, and so people have heard her voice. She had a heavy North Carolina Southern accent, and she loved to read. So one day, many years ago, I came in and she was reading this book, and she said, oh, I've found this book. I think you might like it. It's a little bit over my head, but you probably already know a lot that's in this book, and I think you would enjoy it. And I said, well, what is it? She said, oh, it's written by this author that I really love, Camille Paglia, Sexual Persona, Art and Decadence from Nefertiti to Emily Dickinson. And, I think you might really enjoy it. I take the book, and she had noted throughout the book, I disagree with her here. I think she's on point here. So she had written all these things in the book throughout this book, and I'm like, are you kidding? This is over my head. It's not over your head.
It's interesting that we always feel that women of past generations, perhaps I'm thinking early 1900s, didn't have a college education, but I'm always astounded to discover that women of that time did, and they had reading interests that sometimes shocked their children. I don't know about you, but when I go to the library and take out a library book, someone has illegally written in the frontispiece or along the pages, and sometimes that's more important and interesting to me to see their thoughts than the book itself. Because one, oh, you're allowed to do that? Or two, look what they had to say, and they're often pushing back against it, or they'll say, this isn't spelled right. So there's a communication with a complete stranger and the author of the book. It's a three-way education, really, that's fascinating to me. And your mother clearly did that.
Oh, she did it all the time. She read thousands of books and thousands. She read all her life and would write notes. And she was very well informed and well educated, which brings me around to what you do in the current work you have, which is a publishing company. And you publish mostly books of poetry, a little bit of other stuff as well. And I would love for you to tell us why that is important and give us a sense of what that's all about.
I founded 3 at Taos Press in 2011, and we are now in our 25th book, which I'll talk about later. It's a multicultural press, and I found it was important for people to learn about other cultures and appreciate other values. The second reason I founded it was that I felt writers, and poets in particular, were not being treated well by the publishing industry. Poets would send out a poem that they've worked on for 2 years, which in their mind was a masterpiece. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And they'd never hear anything. Or my favorite was you would receive back not a full page of explanation why they couldn't take your poem or your book, but a tiny sliver that they'd cut into 4 pieces so that they could send the same thing to everyone. Or you'd enter a poetry contest for $25. Never hear anything, never found out who won, and I hoped that we could do it better. As a poet, I felt that way, and because I was an editor for many years in New York, I thought I could probably do better, and I hope we are doing better day by day in responding to people who send us work. And I get probably 5 to 10 poetry submissions a day, but we are by invitation only, so I'm always fascinated how people sort of work around that, and it's kind of delightful. But every single person who sends us a submission is answered within a day or 2. That's the important thing, because to me it elevates publishing and makes it feel like we're all working towards some communal effort.
You clearly have a lot of background in publishing and you know how to do it. How does your press work? How do you get people involved? How do you get their work edited? What's the process, and then how do you market it? Because a lot of people out there have material they'd like to produce. They would love to have something out in the public for people to read, and so how does that work?
I always ask first that if you are going to send us a book, we do not do chapbooks, we do not do individual poems, we do full books, and they usually run about 80 to 100 pages of poetry. Occasionally we choose a hybrid that is about writing poetry or essays on poetry, but we're primarily poetry. I ask people to read our mission statement first. All of our books are themed. We deal with such themes as other cultures, controversial historical figures and time periods in history, aging, hospice work, concern and care for the environment. Lately, we've been doing books on HIV/AIDS and the AIDS pandemic, which people think is over, but it's not, and archetypes of women and archetypes of men, certain mythological issues. So I ask them to read the mission statement because all of our books are heavily themed. Occasionally, we'll do a collection, but the book needs to be cohesive and has to have some sort of a thread running through it. When I receive a manuscript, I have 3 other editors look at it and make sure that we're on the mark about a specific theme. And then it's a collaboration usually between me and the author. I don't ever try to change their style. I consider them a gem. I always say we believe in the beauty of the word and the beauty of the work. And I think many of our books are artworks, and I say that very pridefully. We spend usually about a year working together on the book and editing it. Should it be sectioned? Should it be unsectioned with a theme that runs through it? Is every single poem worthy of the book? Which are the strongest poems? Through the years, I've had poets say to me, oh, no one ever looked at my book, they just published it. For me, as an editor and as a publisher, that's not okay. It's a collaboration. But I'm very careful that it remains their work. We've had through the years a series of wonderful book designers. We currently have, I'm very proud to brag, Leslie Cox of Field Design Associates in Arroyo Seco, and I try to have the people who work on our books from New Mexico because I believe that that's important. And so Leslie is very rare because she reads every single book that comes in. She reads it several times. And then the book design begins, and we look at everything from the font to the heavy weight of the paper to a variety of art pieces that are going to be the cover. I make sure that both the author has a biography and the cover artist has a biography. It's important for people to know why we chose that particular artist. And then begins the heavy work of marketing the book. And we have many channels. Obviously, we send out thousands of emails. We have numerous book launches and events. We have salons. Our current salon is going to be at the Tattered Cover in Denver in September, where a restaurant is now holding salons just for authors. We have many things in bookstores. Obviously, we use the normal sites such as Amazon. I'm very fond of Square, and we are constantly marketing the book. What we have noticed as publisher, editor, authors is that when a book first comes out, it is very easy to sell it, and then everybody sort of relaxes. But the important time for the press is after all the wonderful book launches that the author and the press continue. If a book comes out in the winter, we continue to really begin to market it even more later in the year, spring and summer, because you really can't relax with a book. I was told by the book buyer at Tattered Cover, which is the largest bookstore in the United States, that a book has 8 months on a shelf, and that's about it. So I always look at that 8 month, and then I begin to market even more heavily. I hope that answers your question. What else can I tell you?
So when you market these books, do you have a staff of people who help you, or are you doing this yourself?
In finding a manuscript, I have some editors, two in particular, who are always looking for new people. But in marketing, it tends to be me as the publisher, because I don't like sloppy marketing. I like sort of an elegant marketing. I don't think you can keep pushing a book into people's consciousness constantly. So I try to keep it as elegant as possible, and I think my authors sort of understand that, but it is me. And I'd like to mention her. Melissa Lind is our website person. When a book is at the printer, Melissa instantly, and I mean within a day or two, has everything about the author, the book, the photos up on the site, how you can buy the book. And I found that is particularly effective for us in the press, is the website. But I would say I'm the primary marketer.
Tell us about a couple of the books that you have.
Well, I'm very thrilled to announce that, to me, it's a very big deal that we have our 25th book coming out. Some people do 40 books a year. I think we probably do 6, because I want them to be art forms. So our 25th book is Girl, by Veronica Golos, who is a poet I admire greatly. And it is a book about the fragility and the resilience of girlhood. We'll have a little something on the book saying that it's our 25th book, that we're honoring it. Before that book even came out, it won a huge prize in Lebanon. I love that. It's a very worldly book. Some of our other books include The Unbuttoned Eye and Hum of Our Blood, which I consider companion books. Hum of Our Blood is by Madeline Garner, a Colorado poet. The Unbuttoned Eye is by Robert Carr in Massachusetts. For 33 years, he has been deputy director of the Massachusetts Epidemiology Center, and he's an expert on HIV and AIDS, and both of those books deal in a public and private way about the HIV and AIDS pandemic. Another beautiful book is by Bonnie Rose Marcus, who works for Poets and Writers. It was lovely to meet her. She is a practicing Buddhist and using her Buddhist practice as a hospice worker. I love particularly another book called Ears of Corn Listen by Max Early of the Laguna Pueblo of New Mexico. He is both a poet and potter. The book is definitely an art book. It has both his pottery and poetry. And the fascinating thing about Max is that often he embeds a poem into a pot he is making. Our first book was Collecting Life, and it was a fascinating book because to start your press with an anthology was probably not a very good idea. It involved 88 fairly well-known poets telling us about their private collections of things or their imaginary collections of things. Another book I love was by Veronica Golos called Rootwork. and it was about the life and the love story of abolitionists John Brown and Mary Day Brown. And we've had an enormous reception to that book. At first, we were a little concerned about how that book would play both in the North and the South, and that has never been an issue. And that book is now probably going to be on its third printing. That's one of our most popular books. I also have a hybrid book by poet Leslie Ullman, who is a Yale younger poet. I'm very honored to know her and work with her. And that is a hybrid of poetry and essays about her experiences with poetry, and that's been one of our most popular books.
Well, I am particularly impressed with Leslie Ullman because when I was at Vermont College getting my MFA, Leslie was one of my teachers. In fact, she was deeply engaged with me, and so we had a wonderful connection with that. And Leslie came along with us when we did a writer's workshop in Ireland. She came over to Ireland with us, she and Gladys Swan, and we did a writer's workshop in Ireland, and we titled it the Irish Writing Salon. And we arrived in Ireland, and the people at the hotel said, well, this can't possibly be the Irish Writing Salon. This is the American Writing Salon in Ireland. And we were corrected. So Leslie's really insightful. She's very, very good at what she does.
When I first moved to Taos, I saw that Leslie Ullman lived in Taos. Poetry friends and everyone would say, oh, Leslie Ullman, oh my goodness, have you even met her? And I met her, and we became instant friends, and we were in a poetry group together with several other people. She is a fabulous editor. She has an enormous worldview of literature. She is a very talented poet. I think she's on her 5th book. She's just a pleasure to know because she is so gracious about sharing her knowledge of poetry, and she's also a wonderful reviewer of books. She writes extraordinary blurbs of books. Her knowledge of poetry is ongoing and long-standing. I don't know anyone I really respect more in the field than Leslie.
Well, I feel the same way. And as we're closing this show, why did you choose the name 3, a Taos Press, and make sure you say the website so we know how to get in touch with you?
I chose 3 for so many reasons, more than 3 reasons. I wanted the 3 and more cultures of Taos to be represented. And for me, 3 is a very spiritual and holy number. It represents so many things mythologically. The 3 Furies, the Trinity, heaven, earth, and what we think of as the underworld, mind, body, spirit. 3 is a very important number, and I think sometimes we forget about its symbolism. To get in touch with us, we can be contacted at www.3taospress.com. That's our website, but you can also contact us personally. We like personal contact. 3taospress@gmail.com. Feel free to contact us.
Andrea Watson, thank you so much for being on the road with Twice 5 Miles Radio. I really appreciate your time and all that you do, and I've enjoyed getting to know you over the years, and it's been a real pleasure to get to know you on this show.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be interviewed. It isn't every day you get to be interviewed by someone who has that much knowledge about poetry, prose, how to present it, how to do shows about it. I've respected your work through the years, so thank you for having me here.
And there you go, my friends, my conversation with Andrea Watson. Like I said at the beginning of the show, I did this interview, I guess maybe 3 or 4 years ago. It's one of those evergreen interviews. The information Andrea's information is good today, it was good yesterday, and it'll be good many years from now. Evergreen, as they say. So thank you ever so much for tuning in to Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth listening to and remembering. I'm your host, James Nave. This show's always aired first on WPVM LP Asheville 103.7, streaming online, WPVMFM.org, the voice of Asheville heard all over the world, and on other community radio stations like KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio out of Taos, New Mexico. Thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song, walterparks.com for more of Walter's music. Thank you, Devine Dial, for managing WPVM-FM. We really do appreciate it. Robin Collier, thank you for airing on KCEI. If you would like to reach out to me, Nave at jamesnave.com. You can always send me an email, and I will always answer you when I receive your email. So thank you for that in advance. If you'd like to join me and my creative collaborator, Allegra Houston, any Saturday morning for our Imaginative Storm Writing Prompt of the Week workshop, we would love to have you. The door is open, never a charge for it. You can find the Zoom link at imaginativestorm.com, plus a lot of other material that will help you with your writing if you are inclined to write. And maybe you just write an email or a text. Hey, who knows? That might be helpful too. And before I go, I'll leave you with one little lovely, kind of funny poem written by Ogden Nash, and it goes like this. The termite knocked upon the wood, tasted it, and found it good, and that is why your Auntie May fell through the parlor floor today. Little Ogden Nash ditty to close us out on. Like I said, thanks for tuning in to Twice 5 Miles Radio. I really do appreciate it, and hope you come back sometime soon. Till then, I'll catch you on that turnaround somewhere down the line.